Hey YouTube, how's it going? This is Gamester81 and welcome to another episode. Today's show we're going to take a closer look at the Colecovision. A lot of people ask me, they're like, John, what's your favorite system of all time? And to be honest with you, it's really hard to answer that question because there's so many great systems out there. But when it comes to retro, I'd have to say Colecovision has to take the cake in my book. This was my very first system growing up actually, so it's very nostalgic to me. That might be the main reason why, but I can honestly tell you there's a lot of great features for the system. So let's take a closer look at the system itself, talk about the history, and see some gameplay, and I hope you guys enjoy. Thanks for watching. Okay, so before we dive into the Colecovision itself, and I should point out all the buttons and what these things do and all that good stuff, I do want to just briefly recap you on the history of Coleco as a company, because it's pretty fascinating, believe it or not. Coleco is similar to Nintendo. Both companies did not start off making video games. Coleco actually started in 1932 in the midst of the Depression, which is interesting. And Coleco stands for, it's a contraction, it stands for Connecticut Leather Company. And what they did was they manufactured leather. Up until about the 1960s, they're a huge manufacturer of leather. They sold that division off, and they changed their business model, and they made pools, above ground pools, which is kind of random. And they're actually the worldwide leader of pools, manufacturing above ground pools for many, many years. And that's when Atari released Pong in the early 1970s. And Coleco got wind of this and saw how successful the Pong line was, that they created systems like this it's called the Telestar. And it was basically a Pong clone. There's a whole bunch of different models. This is just one example. This is a Color Tron. This is one example of many that they released that were Pong clones. And they're fairly successful. And that leads us up until early 80s, 1982. There's a plethora of games and systems in the market, a ton of games in the market. This is the beginning stages of the golden age of gaming. So you had games like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong, Galaga. They're all huge and successful in the arcade. So Coleco wanted to bring the arcade experience home to the console market. And for the most part, Coleco succeeded in doing that. Now, another thing to point out, guys, is Coleco had another successful toy line. They made a whole bunch of toys, and one of the toys they made was called Cabbage Patch Kids, which many of you guys probably remember in the 80s. And I think they're even around even today, although they're made by a different company, but they were huge in the 1980s. Okay, so that helped keep the company afloat as well. So that leads us to the system right here. This is a Colecovision. And here's the front. You got your color vision, Colecovision. This is the color kind of rainbow retro 80s look. This is the expansion module interface. This thing opens and closes. There's different modules you can put in there. I'll explain that in a minute. This is your reset. This is your on and off. And this is where your cartridges would plug into. Speaking of cartridges, this is what they would look like. Here is a closer look at a Colecovision cartridge. This one, Game Congo Bongo, was made by Sega. And that's another thing that Coleco did really well, was they got a lot of third-party developers to make some great games. Not only Sega, but they actually had Nintendo, Universal, Konami. Many of the same developers that are around today made games for the Colecovision. And whereas Namco was exclusive to Atari, they reached out and got some great exclusive games for the Colecovision. In fact, a lot of people consider some of the arcade ports to the Colecovision to be superior on the Colecovision than the actual arcade, which is pretty fascinating. But one thing about these cartridges kind of confusing is they're basically the same size as the Atari 2600 cartridges. And not only that, to make things even more confusing, Coleco made games for the Atari 2600. So let me show you. Here's a cartridge for the 2600 by Coleco. This is Donkey Kong Jr. And they're basically the same size. So it even says Coleco on it, so it's even more confusing. But one thing to keep in mind, though, if you don't notice that right there, is the boards. The 2600 board is much smaller in length than the Colecovision, and they're not compatible. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well. Although there was an expansion for this, they could play it. I'll tell you more about that in a second. Let's take a closer look at the controllers themselves. Hold on one second. I think I got a phone call. Hello? Oh, I'm in the middle of a review. Can you call me back later? All right, thank you. Anyway, sorry, someone was just trying to call me on this controller. This thing is ridiculous. It's huge, right? It looks like a phone. And there were inserts that you could put in here, and there was different images that you could push and stuff like that. Here's your directional pad right here. Okay, your stick, and then these are buttons right here, like firing and all that junk, whatnot. Okay, one thing kind of nice about this controller is if you're lefty, you can kind of switch hands and play with it fairly easily. Whereas if you're playing with a control pad, you can't necessarily just flip it upside down. Okay, so that's kind of a nice perk. But if you look in here, they actually plug and unplug in here. And then on the back of the system, you got your RF out, and you got your power adapter. So here's an example of the AC adapter. It's freaking huge, and you could do some serious damage with this thing. And if you want to play this thing on like TVs nowadays, it comes with an RF cable like here. So what you need is you gotta get a coaxial like this, and just screw it in, and this plugs in like that, just so you know. And that works with a lot of retro games. You can get game system. This actually you can get at a Radio Shack for fairly cheap, couple dollars, I think. So that's kind of nice, because most TVs nowadays, in fact, all TVs nowadays, don't have the connection for this thing anymore, which is interesting. There was one more controller I do want to point out to you. You had the super controller right here. This thing almost looks like a glove, and it's pretty cool. And the way it works is your buttons right here, and then this is your stick right here, and you have your buttons right here. This is kind of your menu screen. You get your options here you can choose, and then this is your kind of your trackball, which is pretty cool. And it actually handles really well. And you actually, if you get in a fight, you can actually do some pretty good damage with this thing. But no, honestly though, this is a pretty cool controller. And there's some games that you can only use for this. Like there's a baseball game that was exclusive to this. There's a Star Trek game as well that you can only use this on. So pretty cool. This is called the Super Controller, I believe. So let's take a closer look at another expansion I want to talk to you about. Here's another controller that was used for games like Turbo. This is a Module 2 expansion, and this would plug into the controller port, and you can use this. This is your pad, your foot pedal right there, and this is where you steer. So pretty cool, pretty advanced for back in the day, and it's pretty responsive. This is the expansion Module 2. Now the expansion Module 1 is even better. Let me show you what that's all about. So Coleco, this is really interesting, guys. Coleco released in the 80s, 83, 84 time. They released the ColecoVision Module Expansion 1. And what this allowed you to do was play Atari 2600 on the ColecoVision. So this is how it worked. You know that expansion port I showed you earlier? This would you just open it up, and you'd plug it in like so. And then obviously you wouldn't keep a game in here, but you plug in Atari 2600 game, like so. And then there's ports here for controllers, and that's where that would go. And basically just like Atari 2600, you got your color, you got your left, your right, your game select, and your reset. So that's interesting. So it basically allowed you to play 2600 games on the ColecoVision, which is huge, because keep in mind the 2600 was its biggest competitor. It's almost like if Sony had a thing you could download where you could play Xbox 360 games. That's how big of a deal this was back in the day. Now there was obviously a lawsuit, and Coleco won because I guess apparently this was made with original parts and not the same parts as 2600 was made with. But this was a big deal, and I think this is one of the reasons why the ColecoVision was successful, because you actually play both ColecoVision games and the Atari 2600 games. So if you're a big retro gamer and you're looking to get into systems, definitely like to get both these, because this is a 2-in-1 deal you can get. Okay, so overall the ColecoVision was a very successful system. It only lasted surprisingly only 2 years. So 1984, pretty much the company Coleco pulled out of the gaming industry, but by then they had released about 126 titles, 125 titles in all, and they had sold over 6 million consoles. It's not that rare of a console nowadays. You can go on eBay and get them for fairly common, so it is definitely worth getting. But one of the reasons why Coleco pulled out of the gaming industry was back in 1983 they released a computer called the Atom computer, and they're hoping to kind of take a piece of the computer market as well, because you had Apple, you had IBM, you had Commodore. They were huge. It was a huge market for it back in the day. Okay, unfortunately, the Atom wasn't very successful at all. And if you look at a lot of the games, it says ColecoVision and Atom. So Atom is the computer. It's not some dude who made the system or whatever. It's actually the name of the computer itself. Okay, I did do a review on the Atom computer on one of my earlier videos. I'll probably do a retake on that eventually soon. It is fairly rare, and Coleco lost $80 million doing it, because there's a lot of them broke down and they were very expensive. Speaking of price, this thing when it retailed, the system itself retailed for $175 when it came out in 1982. So let's take a closer look at my game. Okay, real quickly, I just wanted to show you my collection of ColecoVision games. Like I said earlier, there were 128 total released for the ColecoVision. I do want to show you, before I talked about the carts, these are the cassette tapes on the Atom computer I just talked about earlier. These things actually had more memory expansion and stuff like that, so they had better graphics, sound, all that good stuff. There weren't many games released for it, but this one right here is Donkey Kong, and I heard on this version there's a secret 5th stage. You had to push certain buttons. I've seen images of it. But if any of you guys know how to access the 5th stage of Donkey Kong, let me know. I'd love to know so I can do a review on it. I really appreciate it. On to some of the games I own. This is Donkey Kong Jr. And one thing I didn't mention earlier was that Coleco, they marketed it under the CBS brand, over in Europe. So a lot of you guys across the pond and all that good stuff might recognize games that look more like this, the CBS cart. They're kind of shaped a lot differently, okay? But interesting enough, there's no lockout. So the games there's no PAL or anything like that. So this game will work on North American systems. This game will work on PAL systems. It's pretty cool. So there's no lockout. So that's pretty neat. That's a great home port. This is a great port to the arcade, Donkey Kong Jr. You've got Victory. A lot of these games you'll notice are actually arcade games. There are very few games for the Coleco that were non-arcade, but there are a number. You got Pepper 2. Burger Time, which is an awesome port. I love this port of Burger Time. The music's great. War Time's based on the classic movie from the 80s. Gotta love that movie. This is a pretty rare cart. It's Up and Down by Bally Midway. It's a pretty good home port as well. Let's see. This is another rare title. This is Jungle Hunt by Atari Soft. This is actually made by Atari, and these are pretty rare to find. Okay, any Atari games, there's only a handful for the Coleco, but any of them are pretty hard to find. Super Action Baseball. You actually use that Super Action controller, which I showed you earlier. Smurf Rescue of Gargamel's Castle. This is a platformer side scroller, and it was also ported at the 2600, but this is a great port. Okay, very repetitive looking back on it, but this is like one of the first games I ever played. This is Donkey Kong Arcade. This is actually a pack-in for the Colecovision, and one of the reasons why the Colecovision sold so many systems, because this is a great home port, which we're going to show you some gameplay here in a second. This is Time Pilot. Gorf, which is a great game. Another Donkey Kong. This is Star Wars Arcade, which is not bad. Doesn't have the vector graphics, but they did okay with it. This is a Parker Brothers cart. Parker Brothers kind of did their carts all weird, but this is Parker Brothers. This is Popeye, another good port. Made by Parker Brothers, not Nintendo, which is kind of interesting. Space Panic. Cosmic Avenger, which I should show you the box for. Actually, you know what? I didn't show you the box for it. Here it is. This is the box. These boxes are pretty hard to find. As you can see on the cover, it makes you look like you're buying the arcade for your home. Okay, plays like the real arcade game. This is what they advertise on the back. It shows you the screenshot of the game, all the good stuff. So here's the box for Cosmic Avenger. I forgot I didn't show you that. Mr. Do, Bump and Jump, Ladybug, which is an awesome home port. Probably better than the arcade, to be honest with you. This is Frogger, Hubert, which is a great game. Star Trek, which you need that Super Action controller for. Frontline, Space Fury, Super Action Football, Mousetrap, Tapper, which is an awesome port. I did a review on Tapper recently on the arcade on my Gamester81 arcade channel. This is a pretty good, decent port. Root Beer Tapper. Looping, Omega Race, Congo Bongo, which you saw earlier in the video. Carnival by Sega, which is a pretty fun game. Turbo, which you need that controller. Here's Cabbage Patch Kids. Kind of looks like it would be cheesy, but actually plays a lot like Pitfall. So if you like Pitfall, it plays a lot like Pitfall. It's a pretty entertaining game. I might do a review over eventually on this channel. I think you guys would get a kick out of it. Slither, which you need the rollerball controller for, and I misplaced my rollerball controller. I don't know where it is. You got Brain Strainer, and last one I have is Venture. Okay. Oh, one more thing. One thing I also want to point out is there's a lot of homebrews available for the Colecovision. One guy here I know is a good friend of mine. Is New Coleco. He's got a great channel. I'll put a link on the bottom here. He sent me this homebrew. It's called Ghost Blaster. It's pretty cool. I did a review over earlier. He actually signed it for me, all that good stuff. So pretty cool homebrew. And there's a lot of other games available for homebrew as well. There's a huge cult following for the system. Let's check out Donkey Kong. So here is Donkey Kong for the Colecovision. This is the skill level. You can always set your skill levels in most Colecovision games. And for some reason, there's always a slight load time for Colecovision games, even though it's in a cart. On some games, actually, there is none. There's some conspiracies as far as theories as to why this is the case. Some think it's just a loop. Some think it's something to do with the ROMs, emulators, whatnot for the system. But to be honest, Coleco just put it there, and there's no reason for it. Like I said before, there's some games that don't have a delay. But nevertheless, this is Donkey Kong, and this is a great game. This was a packing game for the system, as I mentioned earlier. And it is a little bit different than the arcade in the sense that Donkey Kong's on the far right corner, top right, whereas in the arcade he's in the top left. And I think there's like one less row, I believe. But the sequences are fairly much the same. This is the same sequence as the arcade. This does not have the cement factory, unlike the arcade. This is kind of similar to the Nintendo port. But the graphics are a lot better than the Atari 2600 version, a lot better than the Intellivision version, and the music is great as well. So I just wanted to show you the gameplay, guys, real quick, so you can take a look. I'll do a review on the Colecovision for the Coleco Atom version of Donkey Kong. Thanks for watching, guys. Happy gaming. Until next time, take care.